You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy.
Hello everybody, Covid-19, the international response and economic repercussions. Guys, whatever, it's not that kind of show here. We are just going to be talking, it's Leo and Andrzej, or Andres, how do I say it, Brother Bear? How do you say it? I think you say it better than...
Andrzej, I don't know, I'd never learned Polish. I should try and learn.
Completely pointless investment. There's about 1,000 things that you're better off doing before we're even contemplating that.
It's actually a completely pointless investment of my time, but I'd at least know how to say your
including
name.
Pythag.
Absolutely.
Pythagoras.
Including algebra.
Anyway, how are you?
Yes, yeah, keeping safe, keeping well over here in Canada, the safe America, as they say.
Good, glad to hear it. We're definitely living in very strange times. I think this will be remembered for decades and potentially centuries to come. I think over here across the pond there's been a lot of criticism, more than usual, directed towards our politicians, and I suppose to some extent that's pretty predictable, given that's sort of a British pastime anyway, but often unjustified.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, to be honest, it's very easy to sneer at politicians, and obviously they've got a lot of faults and they are public servants, but hey, at the end of the day, you know, would we perform any better in their position? And that's something that we could never pass judgment on, really.
Well, cast your mind to the distant memory of Brexit. Theresa, given the circumstances, did pretty well. She was in a pretty impossible position, and I think she made the best of a bad situation. But let's enough of Theresa, more of COVID, more on Bojo and the great Boris himself. Boris. Yeah, I mean, there's no end of criticism to the old
Boris, the Boris
blonde buffoon. I mean, we love him, and we sort of loved him when he wasn't in power. Now he's in power, it's sort of somewhat terrifying.
Well, he's much more vulnerable,
entertaining at the same in equal measure.
Yeah, I mean, before he was more of a character that people related to in various ways, but now he's actually got the baton when it comes to imposing power. He's a lot more vulnerable to criticism, and you know the buffoon act that people related to before is probably not. It's not got the same pizzazz to it.
No, definitely, it's all become a bit too real. This buffoon's in charge, and everyone's a bit terrified. He's in charge. He's the captain, and that's yeah. I mean, for all like his endearing qualities, it is you do wonder what's beneath that veneer of buffoonery. You know, is there genuine competence there? I don't know, to be honest, because I think the buffoonery is sometimes so sort of convincing. It's hard to tell who the person underneath actually is. And I think that's the case with a lot of politicians. You have to have some sort of public veneer, and then your true self is never really there, which is a shame, right? Because I don't know, maybe if there were, I'm sure there are politicians that are their true selves and sort of, you know, are 100% their authentic selves. You see it even at work, where there's hardly any sort of public scrutiny.
Yes.
Ask the question, not very pointed, but just allude to it, like how much of your authentic self do you bring to work? And, you know, it's rarely the case that people bring 100% of themselves.
So we wear many hats and many masks, I suppose, in different situations. And when it comes to commercial and sales environments, which I know we're both used to and we both have experience with, there is always a veneer to some degree, and you see that from people at the bottom that are just learning the ropes right through to, you know, the top management levels. So yeah, I think that those masks are always present, and when it comes to politics, they're ever growingly important. I mean, there was actually, I was looking back at a few A-level politics questions from probably about the 1980s, and they were asking things like, when class politics is dead, are characters and salesmanship in politics the replacement of that? And it's quite a poignant and interesting question, because when you stop identifying with a tribe, and usually I mean, from a European perspective, that's often class, your working class, your middle or upper class. That will determine whether you vote for a socialist or a conservative-leaning party. When those sort of class boundaries start to erode in the sense of, in the way they do in the US, you start to look at, well, who's the character, who's relatable, who do I think looks cool, who makes me laugh. These are the kind of variables that you look at when deciding who to, where to put your X on the ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's just, social dynamics writ large. And speaking of social dynamics, I think it's quite an unhealthy situation we're in right now. Everyone's in isolation, right? No one's really interacting, talking to each other. It's, and you kind of think like, am I going to wake up and this is kind of a bad dream? But you think back to the beginning, right? What was the beginning? What was the origin of all this? It was, well, there were like inklings of it back in December, January. But then even, it hadn't hit the public consciousness, at least in the Western world, at all at that point.
No.
And,
No.
I suppose, like, I thought of it like this. It was a bit like the boy who cried wolf, right? There was MERS, never really amounted to anything. Similarly with SARS, didn't really amount to anything. And it was like, this COVID thing, coronavirus, whatever, it's probably just going to be another MERS or another SARS. That wasn't to be.
Or another bird flu.
Right. But I think there was such a complacency in the West, both from government and on the population individual level. On so many fronts, right? People just like, whatever, shrug it off. And it only was really sort of late, March that people started thinking, okay, this one's a bit different.
Yes.
And I think that Western complacency probably didn't put us in best stead in terms of dealing with this. But you can hardly blame them because, like I said, like this is the boy who cried wolf, one thing, yeah, but also this isn't something that's happened in living memory. There aren't many people around now that sort of remember the Spanish flu.
No. I mean, that's the only comparable thing. And obviously that was taking place in a time where international travel was a fraction of what it is today.
That's a really good point, yeah.
No one can really relate to it. But you're absolutely right. The Western complacency, I think, was partly born out of immediate comparisons with, you've got your avian flu, you've got your swine flu.
Yeah, the bird flu, forgot about that one. Yeah, the swine flu. You're right.
Yeah, I mean these things were sort of niggling on the back of your mind, like, well, that's quite a scary prospect. But when nothing really came out of it that tangibly changed people's lives, you could still order an Amazon package on Prime and or whatever. You could go to work. You could carry on with your daily life without having to actually do much different. So I don't think anyone was expecting something of this grander scale. But it's,
and in fact, it was funny, like, you think of it, like, the swine flu and the bird flu, like, thinking back to those got more media attention. It kind of, with the same number of cases as we had with coronavirus hardly got any attention if we look at the number of cases we had with swine flu at that point. I think it was very much a case of the boy who cried wolf. People didn't take it seriously, like, yeah, right, it's one of those. It's another swine flu. It's another MERS. And I suppose that just sort of propagated complacency, which has obviously put us on the back foot pretty much from day one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
this has caught us off guard.
Absolutely, yeah. The boy who cried wolf is really the perfect analogy for this particular pandemic. And I think back to the day that Britain left the European Union legally on January 31st. There were mass gatherings in Westminster. People were partying. People were protesting. It was this insane sort of moment for the country that was incredibly polarizing. And the idea of a global pandemic, even though we were only sort of a month and a half away from that, just seemed so distant. There wasn't talk of it at all. So, as you say, Boy Who Cried Wolf, perfect analogy to really sum up people's mindset this time round.
Yeah. I think it's just crazy how petty politics and sort of political discourse can just be put into perspective so quickly when you're faced with an existential crisis. And that's kind of like inspiring, but also humbling at the same time.
Yeah,
It's a weird one because it brings people together. I mean, certainly. I mean, today was Thursday, just an hour and a half ago, because it's 9:30 now. We had the clapping for the NHS, and people turn out in force, and you can hear people, beating the pans with wooden paddles, clapping. And I've never, certainly in my life, never seen that sort of true community spirit. People kind of clapping for the one cause together. There is sort of an element of like rose tinted glasses on. The British Blitz spirit maybe coming back in a different form. But it is very life affirming, and I think the general compliance, and I speak generally because there have obviously been people who've not complied with the measures, has been quite inspiring to see sort of people band together against a common enemy. Obviously it's an invisible enemy, but I think that's quite an inspiring thing. I've never seen that before.
No.
Quite so, I haven't seen people band together quite so obviously.
I agree. I mean, I think what it reminds me of a conversation I had with my grandmother. She's turning 90 this year, and we were talking. I think it was back in 2015, and she was just telling me how easy and convenient things are now, but what she was stressing to me was that the flip side of that is we have the luxury to be selfish, and we have the luxury to only focus on our own affairs. And I think that, as you say, obviously there is some non-compliance with certain individuals, but generally, that sort of communalism has returned in certain spheres of life. Because we don't have a choice but to look out for one another. We can't simply look out for ourselves and our families. We have to look beyond that because we are all connected. And this pandemic has highlighted that.
And I think that's one of the silver linings, right? Like almost bringing back or bringing into focus and bringing some much needed perspective. Kind of at the moment where we were sort of getting into the doldrums and the repetitive machine of earning and burning, whatever you want to call it. I think this is a sort of a healthy way of breaking that up and sort of saying, hang on, wait, stop. Think about what you're doing. Is it really what you want to be doing in life? I think a lot of people are asking, more people than ever are asking that question right now anyway, before this whole virus thing. But I think that virus thing has probably brought it more to the fore than ever before. And I think people are asking sort of deep existential questions. Are we doing the right thing? Am I helping the planet? There's other grand crises that have been sort of pushed to the background. We're not talking on the scale of Brexit. I'm talking international, global crises. Like climate change. Are people? Is this potentially a catalyst for people thinking on a more global, big society scale? I hate to use that word because that was the bloody Cameron's
that's right
slogan, wasn't it? That jammy dodger got us into this Brexit
that's
mess.
Right.
But you're right, it's sort of a more global perspective, I suppose. This virus has become a global pandemic, so maybe there is another silver lining in that we will see each other as a one global community, and sort of like not through maybe economic means, where we've seen that through globalization, but I think nations will naturally become more self-sustaining, but I think to see each other as a peoples of Earth as opposed to nations, and I think that will be maybe a natural pushback against the strong nationalism we've seen in so many parts of the world.
I think that's definitely an optimistic way of looking at it. I mean, some people are predicting that the pandemic is going to mark an end to our romanticization of market society and mass individualism, and obviously that can go different ways. That can be turned into sort of an authoritarian regime, whether that's something fascist or something authoritarian and socialist. But it may, on the contrary, actually just reduce self-seeking behaviors, and it may change people's understandings and where they put emphasis on patriotism. So, like in the US, for example, patriotism is strongly linked with your armed forces. You thank your veterans, you buy them coffees, You know, you basically say thank you for your service. Maybe some of those thank yous are going to be shifted to, you know, the pharmacists and the nurses and the doctors of the world. You know, maybe a new strain of patriotism will come out of that isn't so much about expansionism and what some people would term neo-colonialism, but actually, you know, thanking people on the front lines that are sacrificing their welfare for everyone else's.
Yeah, because I think the doctors and nurses on the front line, they're sort of the true heroes of this in every sense of the word. It's amazing. I mean, I can't imagine sort of, you know, as a sort of, I suppose, a duty to your job and your profession to go out there and knowingly sort of push yourself and I suppose expose yourself to the very real dangers and risks of catching the disease. And you know, this is no benign disease, and there's been a vast amount of conspiracy theories circulating with that, which I think is really sad and really just so petty and inappropriate given the severity of the situation and the people putting their lives on the line. And I suppose just fundamentally a really terrible disrespect to the ones who've died from this. Because this is, like, one thing's for sure, okay, it's maybe not as bad as we first envisioned, which is a great thing, but it's certainly no flu. It's no seasonal flu, that's for sure.
No.
And I think particularly with the sort of swirling conspiracy theories that we've seen in and around this, some of them like have some validity and some reasonable grounds. So, for example, say like the Wuhan China high security biosafety lab, you know, that did have some. That's a valid comment because it's actually the largest virus bank in Asia. It's got something like 1,500 strains of different viruses.
Really?
So like it is a coincidence, and you do have to ask the question of like, I hadn't heard of Wuhan before all of this. I don't know if you had.
No, I had no knowledge of that area. You know.
Yeah, I mean, apparently it's got the largest virus bank in Asia. So there you go.
Maybe that. So how far was that virus?
I'll tell you what, this virus has really put it on the map, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, how far is the bank roughly from the wet market? Is it quite close?
I know it's on the outskirts of Wuhan. I don't know what the distance is in terms of kilometers or miles, but it's just funny, right? Because the largest virus bank in Asia, also the biggest pandemic in the last century, bar the Spanish flu. Well, we don't know yet, right? This isn't over. We're certainly not out of the woods. Let's not, get complacent here. But I think just going back to the point of this conspiracy theories, I think, you know, the one around Wuhan, China, the biosafety lab, does have holds some water. The ones around 5G though, just crackpot ideas and just really not very helpful, because and ultimately dangerous, right? Because there was a lot of censorship around some of the 5G interviews that were had, namely the one like on London Real, David Icke and all that. And you know, although yes, I defend to the death of anyone to say whatever they want, there is a point at which I think you have to draw a line and say, sort of the thing you're preaching is fundamentally dangerous, and if enough people listen to it, you're kind of undermining and potentially, you know, risking many lives more than is necessary. And so it's a fine line, you know. Kind of, I'd hate to think I'm a proponent of censorship and of that sort, where you'd sort of delete the channel of London Real from YouTube, but at the same time, I see the other side.
Yeah.
That it's crossing a very definite line of where you're putting lives at risk in a very real way, because if people start doubting whether the virus is real and then start burning 5G towers crucial to communication and all that, it certainly hampers any sort of efforts or ambulance calls, and just the social distancing is shunned. I don't know. What's your opinion on that? It's a funny one.
Well, this is the sort of the age-old question of where do you draw the line between free speech and censorship? Because there are aspects to censorship that do protect people, and they're, you know, for the censorship laws are there for certain genuine reasons. But then there's other aspects that really are dangerous. I mean, I think when it comes to misinformation, we live in such an age of checkered and extreme information. So back in the pre-internet era, the experts that people have come to hate had the informational advantage, and they had the informational advantage over everybody. Since then, now you have all these sort of theories or beliefs or objectives all being postulated around the internet, and now these experts, that their informational advantage has been significantly weakened. On the case of the coronavirus, and on the case of the effects of COVID-19, some of these theories are incredibly dangerous, because it only takes one person who's caught the sniffles to go out and infect 10 really vulnerable people, and they've chosen to do that because they believe that actually the coronavirus is a hoax, or actually it was something that was triggered by the establishment of 5G. So I don't know, it's a tough one, but I'd say that there are certain fallacies that just need to be publicly debunked, for the public good, really. I mean, I think with coronavirus, it's been absolutely terrible what's happened so far, and we seem to be reining it in, from my knowledge of what's going on in Europe and the Western world. We seem to have passed the peak, which is great, but obviously we don't want to run the risk of pedaling back on that, because some of these dangerous views gain traction in the general population.
Yeah, I think this sort of ubiquitous nature of data and information, and quite reputable information, and kind of the ability of anyone to jump onto that and almost hijack it and take it on as their own, and then almost become a charlatan, or not a charlatan in many people's eyes, and people take it as gospel, is quite a dangerous position you're in, because you're kind of in this age of post-truth. I think I've sort of heard people allude to that concept before, where I suppose the phenomenon of fake news, right, that wasn't a thing 10 or even 5 years ago, to be honest. The fact that for their own gain, networks or sites will propagate some sensationalist headlines for the sake of views and clicks, because that's how ad revenue is made, right? But I think that's a whole separate topic. I think we're opening up a can of worms there, to be honest.
Yeah, the whole post-truth fake news topic, you could go on for hours about, but I mean, one thing I will say though on that is that I do believe there's always been fake news. I just now feel that the sources of fake news are much more broad in their informational scope, and in terms of contributors to fake news, it's also increased greatly. So the potential pool of people that can create fake news, instead of now being 10 major newspapers and news outlets, it's now billions of potential people around the world. That has left the informational scope even wider. So we've seen resurgences in, for example, the Flat Earth movement, which actually has a strong set of roots in Britain. I believe the Flat Earth Society are actually headquartered in Dover, in England. So there's...
Did you tell me about that experiment, Leah? Because that was awesome. You told me about that experiment where they sent a guy down with on a canal, in the straightest canal in the UK, like a 4-mile stretch of straight canal in a canoe. And then basically they were looking at this guy, and they were like, because according to common scientific knowledge, if he rows for 4 miles, he should disappear.
Yeah.
Or something like that. And then I think you told me about the Bedford experiment with like these... Tell me about that. There was like holes they were looking through.
So for those who don't know, for listeners who don't know, the Bedfordshire is a county in the east of England, and it's incredibly flat. It's one of the flattest parts of the UK. So
that gives you an idea of why you should come to the UK. Come to Bedford, see the flattest part of the UK. It's a place of national heritage.
Absolutely. Forget about the Highlands of Scotland. Forget about the Lake District. Forget about the sights of London. Go to Bedford and experience true flat Earth. Kansas has nothing, Oklahoma has nothing on Bedfordshire, but these individuals basically did a level experiment, and I think it involved like a number of staggered posts with sights and binoculars on a level, and again I think they were watching somebody canoe away from them, and making a statement that the further this person got away, their canoe should disappear completely. I don't know what the results were, but I know that the Bedford level experiment is, and it's become very popular in the United States.
It's undeniable proof, Leo. Come on.
Right. This is the undeniable truth. This is the evidence, smoking gun evidence that NASA are all actors. So.
NASA are all actors. All the scientists, all reputable scientists are actors. Absolutely. Bedford is real. Okay.
Bedford is real. Newton has nothing on Bedford. So
some say the laws of physics break down in Bedford.
Some say that compasses just spin on their axis in Bedford. So but I think we're digressing here. I mean, let's.
No, I don't think we are. I think, there's definitely a segue from Bedford to the economic repercussions of Covid-19. I think there's a very obvious sort of gradient.
Well,
here.
there's actually...
and I'm going to try and pull that off.
There's a massive 5G tower near Bedford, so, we need to look...
Yeah, I mean, that's a well-known thing because it's so flat. I mean, that they put the biggest towers up there. 5G towers and David Icke. Great stuff, guys. So I think we're certainly not out of it yet. There was an article I saw. Bill Gates was talking, because Bill Gates has talked about pandemics for a long time and talked about them as our sort of greatest continuous existential threat as a species. Forget nuclear war, forget global warming even. It's the pandemic that we really need to be worried about. And we're ill prepared for it is what the end message is. And I think probably what we've seen so far is probably evidence of that. Yes, I think we've been lucky in the sense that maybe the coronavirus hasn't been as aggressive as we first feared, in the sense that healthcare systems have been stress tested adequately. So we're sort of prepared for when the real one strikes, inverted commas. Now, that's no disrespect to anyone who's suffered through this. It's just the fact that I think, this is not, all I'm saying is it's not as bad as we thought it initially was. And it will lead to healthcare systems that are better prepared for these kinds of things. And the healthcare systems that won't be complacent. And I'm not saying that the UK was overly complacent. I think it was muddled, but unprecedented. It's hard to criticize. Like, honestly, if you look at it really neutrally, it's hard to criticize any government reaction. I mean, look at it. You've got a whole spectrum from Sweden to sort of herd immunity, all the way through to Singapore, locked down hard and sort of almost a military-esque discipline. And it's kind of like no one really knew which one would work. It was just kind of every country went with its sort of prevailing political values and ideals of how a society should be run. Okay, that's what I felt.
On the case of Sweden, I would like to stop you there and ask you a bit about that, because this concept of herd immunity, I feel like has certain hints, certain nodes of social Darwinist, hyper-capitalist, survival of the fittest. Why would a country like Sweden, Andre, why would a country like Sweden that's been heralded as one of the successful examples of state socialism, why would they take it upon themselves to pursue a herd immunity approach?
I think what it is, really, mate, is I think it's a political statement, right, from whatever the ruling party is. I think the parties generally there are ultra-liberal. And so what they want to do is demonstrate that ultra-liberalness of theirs through affording their citizens ultra-liberal measures during this virus, and almost saying, like, it's in your hands. You're the ones who are going to fall or kind of win or fall through this virus. So use common sense. And not much more. I've not dug in a huge depth in terms of what the details of the Swedish method were. But my understanding was the trust was very much sort of handed, the gauntlet was very much handed to the citizens of Sweden. And they were sort of use common sense, do the social distancing, but nothing that was sort of enforced in any way, shape or form, either through police or military. God forbid, because I think it was, as much as it was practical in that they didn't have to, throw out. I don't know about the welfare side of things actually on Sweden, but what I do know is that they entrusted their citizens with the common sense to do the right thing at the time. But then I think, no one knows what the right thing is at the time, because like I say, going back to the fact that this is an unprecedented event, it's hard to criticize any government strategy at this time. Because, okay, look, when we're past all this, in hindsight, you can quite easily point to which country did well, which country didn't do well. And more likely than not, it's the ones that are going to be stringent or sort of reacted earliest that did better than the ones that didn't. But then the Swedish deaths, if you look at the statistics, were in fact relatively low. If you look at it on the Eurocentric, from the Eurocentric perspective. I mean, I think at one point Sweden was drastically lower than UK, in fact, throughout. Now, you can put that down to the size of cities, the population, all sorts of things. I think the UK care home issue needs to be looked into. I think that was a disaster. Although it's hard to pass judgment, without having all the facts, but it was something that wasn't looked at in enough detail, and probably something that was sort of sidelined to some extent, and it was very much kind of all hands on board with NHS, and maybe the care homes took was sort of an afterthought, if you see what I mean. But,
which may have distorted the figures. I mean, from what I can see in the UK, the two major issues that I would call out the government for, and this isn't just this government, it's successive governments over the past 20 years, from both parties really. The two things I would call them out on is one, the sort of inherent and constant cuts and certain monetizations of the NHS that have really put them in a bad position, in light of a global pandemic. I mean, there's so many indicators that show that despite population steadily rising in the UK, the adequate supply of medicines, of hospitals, of staff has just been cut for various reasons. And the second thing, which is more of a critique of the Johnson administration, would be down to reaction time. And I think looking at the time it took them, and the amount of cases it took them to close schools and to close pubs and shops was just far too late, and that's led inevitably to the higher number of deaths that we see today.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think there was quite a bit of dithering, and I don't know if that sort of reflects on Johnson's character as a person, because we all know, sort of have a vague idea of what he may be like in sort of, at least in public, but whether he's a different person, a drastically different person in office and kind of in the confines of his closest allies, I'd struggle to think he's a drastically different person. I'm sure there is that element of dithering and sort of, I suppose, not an obvious incompetence, but just a sense of not being decisive enough when it really counts. So I think we're certainly not out of the woods yet. That much is clear. The keeping the R number down is clear. I think the messaging in the UK, there was certainly a little bit of pushback to start with around, because it was like stay at home, help the NHS save lives. Now it's stay alert as opposed to stay at home, which is more of a more vague guideline than stay at home, which is a pretty obvious one. So, I mean, you've had people in their droves go out this weekend, and particularly the hottest day of the year so far, I think it was Thursday. People who've been furloughed and complaining that their kids need to go back to school or shouldn't go back to school, flooding the beaches of Bournemouth and Brighton, which is, ultimate hypocrisy. But, I'm sure there are the ones that obeyed all the social distancing and all that. I'm not pointing fingers or blaming anyone. But it's just an observation. And then I don't think we're going to return to normal life or anything resembling normal until we have the vaccine, right? Because until we have that vaccine, there's no assurance whatsoever of it potentially a second or third wave.
Right, exactly. There's no guarantee that it's fully eradicated from society. I mean, you can definitely be stronger with travel regulations, because we found that the amount of travel people did soon after the virus outbreak really exacerbated it, and the amount that we travel now has spread it at a real exponential rate. But as you say, until we find an actual vaccine, there's not really life will not restore to normality. Society will be inherently different.
No, and I think it's going to be inherently different whether we get a vaccine or not. But you're right, in terms of the day-to-day, sort of going back to work, the full-time job, the office, all of these things we became so used to. Yeah, I think until we have the vaccine, I find it hard to believe or foresee how we could restore anything resembling exactly what we had before all of this. But yeah, I mean, if we just look at sort of the economic repercussions of all of this, right? So I think one way you could look at it is almost like you've had this disaster, you've had this tsunami that's hit, and then you're looking at the wreckage now. So although I'm saying we've not come through it, I think there's something that's coming to the fore of people's minds, which is, what are the economic consequences of all of us kind of not being at work? What is the ultimate economic impact of all of this, right? Because this isn't without consequence. Certainly, it's unprecedented in our generation, or our parents' generation for that matter, of having people away from work and being funded essentially by the government for such a period of time across the board.
Absolutely. I think when the pandemic hit and jobs and society as we know it was ground to a halt, people's initial reaction was, this is awful, what am I going to do with all my time? I want to go back to work, which is a completely natural reaction. I think now we're in a position whereby people are actually starting to adapt and mirror their surroundings. So, perhaps people who have been home for 8 weeks now, with a significant amount of funding from the government, or if not, just working from home, there's a lot of comfortability in that, not putting a tie on and doing your hour or hour and a half commute, whether it's on a train or in your car. That old way of life doesn't seem appealing. And, you've got the same with the student population as well. You'll have students that if they can really do their courses from home and engage in online meetings, these students are going to say, well, actually, is it really that appealing to spend a load of money on a dorm room and be on campus all the time? So I think people will begin to question, the old ways of life, as were they actually that efficient in terms of use of time, in terms of spending of money? How efficient were they, and were people really getting the benefit back? Another thing is like meetings. People are starting to realize how pointless a lot of meetings were, and that they could have just been done by a single email.
Yeah, absolutely.
Freeing up loads of time.
I think meetings are the biggest. So much time, so many hours and years are wasted in meetings. It's unbelievable.
Decades.
But decades are wasted every day. No, probably. Like, if you look at it cumulative, like, there's probably decades, probably hundreds of centuries wasted on a daily basis globally.
Most likely. Most likely.
I'm not a big fan of meetings, but that's for another time. Yes, mate, I'd say with the uni students, I feel sorry for them, right? Because they're paying $9,000 for the year, not just for the course and the lectures. Obviously, that's a huge part of it, but also just the university experience and living away from home. I'd hate to, be working from home from a laptop, listening to the lectures in my first, second, or even third year. Like, I think for a lot of us, it was, our first real taste of independence.
Yeah.
I feel sorry for them, forking out $9,000, putting yourself in debt for working from home. It's, I'd hate to be in that position.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's got to be killing them, really. I always saw university almost like a halfway house, between being a boy and being an adult, because, you're sort of in this, this penned off area, where you're not having to grapple with things like car payments or credit cards, or like a proper concept of managing your money. You're heavily reliant on basically debt. So your liability column is huge, but you're having a fantastic time. You're having a great experience. You're meeting all these new people constantly. And effectively, I think with being a student, that's part of what you pay for. You pay for the experience that makes you more of a well-rounded human being, as wishy-washy as that sounds.
No, absolutely. I think it's a university of life. As cheesy as that sounds, of life. Because we both went to Manchester. For the viewers listening. We met at the greatest city in the world,
Bloody
Manchester.
Fantastic city, Manchester. I won't hear a bad word said about it.
Or what about barbars? Ooh, what about revs? Ooh,
Barbar revs, very naughty, very cheeky, very cheeky.
Yeah, Fifth Ave, love it.
Fifth Ave, love it. Great night out. Great indie tracks.
Guys, if anyone's from Manchester, let us know if Fifth Ave's still there. Had a few good nights there. I know it's a bit rubbish, but nonetheless, I seem to recall 80p Jaeger bombs on a Wednesday.
Yeah, nothing
lethal.
That's going to break the bank.
Absolutely lethal.
It was a place of hedonism and ridiculousness, and I think back to it with rose-tinted shades on. But it was probably an abysmal place in another way as well.
Absolutely. I've been back since and thought, like, what the hell was I thinking?
What was I doing here? Why did I ever enter this place?
Why did I ever visit the Curry Mile? I lived on the Curry Mile. Curry Mile's a great place. Shout out to those living on the Curry Mile. Absolute beauty spot of the Northwest.
Fantastic city, Manchester. I mean, one of the greatest cities.
The fucking it's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and also I know there's a big push for graphene research.
That's right. I mean, there's been a lot of scientific research done at the University of Manchester, and of course you've got the Manchester Victoria University, and also just the musical history of Manchester has been fantastic.
That's true. Don't forget Oasis, lads.
Oasis. Don't ever forget Oasis.
No, later. No singing now. Okay, so I think if we look at Manchester and the COVID response, I'm joking. We're not getting that specific, guys. Nowhere are we getting into that.
That's a rabbit hole. Let's look at the town of Cheadle in Cheshire.
Let's talk about Oasis.
See how they've individually, their local councils have responded to the COVID crisis.
Because I think it's really important we look at Buxton. No, Buxton needs to be put on the map.
Never got the international recognition they deserve. Right, but
it needs help. In fact, I think this is a big point, mate, because you have a background, if I'm not wrong, in the travel tourism industry. Tell us about how that's been hit.
So, travel and tourism is... I always talk about the travel industry as a discretionary industry, in the sense that it's great that it exists, but effectively is a luxury. So it's not by any means essential, like, you know, your groceries or your pharmaceuticals. But
or your consulting, please.
Nevertheless, it had an extremely adverse reaction to COVID. I mean, the travel industry is always adversely affected by economic shocks, because the first thing you cut when you lose your job is your holiday. You know, it's not your groceries, it's not your banking services, it's your holidays, your vacation time. But obviously, with the nature of COVID, you know, it's been a terrible. You know, the level of risk is so high with air travel and things like that. But a lot of hoteliers, independent, big blue chip hoteliers, you know, your sort of Marriotts, your Hiltons of the world, these organizations are looking far more intensely at automation and the potential of AI to basically cut some of their operational costs and deliver more tailored solutions for their customers. And this is a direct result of the economic fallout of COVID. So I don't know. I mean, Andre, do you think that perhaps, because I know you've looked quite deeply into the economic implications of COVID. Do you think that this is going to be some kind of catalyst for cross-industry automation and artificial intelligence becoming more of a daily part of people's business lives?
broadly speaking, the technological transformations that are already in place are only going to be accelerated by COVID. So some of the trends you already saw, the one I'm probably closest to is the likes of automation, and specifically RPA, or robotics process automation. And I think companies are only going to look at those sorts of technologies more favorably, given what we're going through and what we will be going through, and what the world will look like in the next 5, 10, 20 years. I think the realization that it's only going to accelerate what's already in play. And so I think the travel industry is obviously one that's been hit hard. I think with myself in consulting, I can see certain industries even having an uptake in terms of consulting, from sort of how do we cope with this? How do we maintain our services? I think the likes of FS, financial services and resources, obviously been hit harder than most. I sort of sit in the comms and media space. So, in fact, some parts of that comms and media space have seen quite an uptick in terms of demand. You know, comms being a particularly vital industry, given our current context and situation. I mean, look at the rise of some of these technology companies, the likes of Zoom. You know, never seen the sort of volumes that you're seeing now. It's quite incredible, actually. And I think it's going to be a cross-industry thing. You know, industries are forced to adapt. There was one crazy example, I think, in New York I was looking at. There was a pizza restaurant, and they had an oven, obviously like a pizza oven that goes up to something like crazy, like 400 degrees Celsius. And they looked at repurposing that oven, and it worked to use it as visors against the coast. So it was hot enough to bend this plastic into visors against protective equipment against the virus, and selling that to hospitals. Genius. Yeah, and it's that kind of innovation, that human ingenuity, that will emancipate us from this ultimately. Because you can talk about things like the debt cycle and the political landscape, but ultimately it's the human spirit and the human innovation and the human ability to adapt that's so unique in the animal kingdom that will ultimately lift us out of this.
Definitely. Now, you raise a really good point there. That brings me on to, you know, going against the grain of this inherent pessimism of the human spirit. And there's a great tendency to be pessimistic about the human spirit and our ability to adapt and evolve, especially in times of crises. You know, that pizza restaurant example is a fantastic one. Another brilliant example would be the pivoting of companies that make and sell alcoholic beverages into converting that into hand sanitizer pumps and dispensaries. So there is an ingenuity. People do adapt naturally. And I'm very interested to see how industries that have been hit the hardest readapt and sort of make themselves sort of friendly and more hygienic in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is no doubt a massive disruptor. In fact, I don't think anyone's untouched by this. You know, one way, in a positive or negative sense. This is global, and it affects every industry and every facet of your industry, for better, for worse. Because there are obviously, you know, there are certain petrochemical companies that you'd think, you know, have faced the crash in the oil price, but there's certain petrochemicals, you know, the distillation of oil, there's various levels to it, and certain derivatives of crude oil are actually used for hand sanitizer, and they've obviously done very well for themselves in the recent months. But there's certainly a question across the board, and this is certainly more the rule than the exception, is that there's definitely massive holes in terms of income and balance sheets. So in income with people, which is being greatly subsidised in the UK context with the 80% of your income, and then balance sheets in terms of what companies get what compensation, or I think that's a big question that needs to be answered. And it's not it's not an easy question to answer. So the production of money and credit by central banks, you know, is a difficult one. It's kind of like what companies are worth saving. It will come down to that question, because you can't save everyone. And, you know, you'd like to think things like your national carriers, so your British Airways and your sort of homegrown industries will be the first to be saved and sort of on the priority list. But then there are other industries that will inevitably not get the government subsidy or the government backing and will default. So, and I think what you're seeing right now in terms of sort of the closest resemblance of what we're seeing right now is probably the 1930 to 45 period, where you had high levels of debt production, and through those, and the high levels of government borrowing, also the 0% interest rates, pretty unprecedented in terms of our living memory, and the likes of the Fed in America buying the treasury debt, and then government welfare on people's income, right? So I don't know, maybe just give me a flavor of what that's like in America, because I feel like in the global context, the UK deal for people is fairly generous in terms of 80% of your income on a monthly basis.
What I can comment on is not so much on the individual scale what American citizens are currently experiencing. What I can comment on is some of the situation in Canada, and Canada launched what's called CERB, which is an emergency response benefit that gives you $2,000 a month for, I think, the next 4 months, or it might be the next 6 months. And this is for individuals who have lost their jobs, who are unable to work, or quarantining, again related to COVID-19. In the US, as you just cited, you know, you have the purchase of treasury bills, and you know, the last time that happened on a grand scale was with the buying of government bonds by the Federal Reserve in America, which a lot of people aren't aware is actually one of the root causes, the very root initial causes of the 2008 recession, because there was so much money, there was so much paper fiat currency in the money supply, but obviously that just did not match people's levels of innovation or like the levels of growth. You know, usually when there's money created, it comes out of productivity, it comes out of people inventing things.
Yeah, genuine value.
Genuine value, exactly. Value add services. But, you know, you can't create wealth. That's the thing. We've seen this through hyperinflation in a range of countries. We've seen it in Germany in the 1930s, and in certain African states as well. And that's what I'm fearing is going to be a result of, you know, some of the endless printing of money, whether this is in the US or Europe, and also the amount of indebtedness from funding the population, which is an inevitable public good when people lose their jobs or it's unsafe to go in. But what's really scary, but also potentially exciting in terms of the innovations that could come out of it is going to be how the economy reacts and reshapes to this huge amount of indebtedness.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of debt holes that are going to be created through all of this, one, welfare, and also bailing of companies. So there's a question that's pending. It's a very important question. So who will pay for all of this, and how will it be paid, and how are you going to manage it? Like, are the taxes going to be raised in a very real way, or is the cost of goods and services going to go up? It's not clear cut at this stage, but it's certainly something that everyone's thinking about. But look, make no mistake, we're certainly in a new world. Like, this is no 2008. This is very different.
No,
okay,
exactly.
People were speculating about a recession anyway, and this is, you know, a recession would have been minor compared to what we have right now. So, like I said, I think this period very much reflects what we had in the 1930 to 45 period. There's going to be a lot of differentiation in terms of the entities and the people that benefit and those who don't. And there's a big question to be answered about, like I said, who ends up with what. The wealth redistribution, there's got to be a wealth distribution of some sort, right? I think society in general over time tends towards inequality, and the inequality tends to exacerbate over time, and that leads to somewhat regular revolutions whereby you redistribute the wealth in some form or another. And I think that's what revolutions are, right? They are a redistribution, a disgruntlement at the bottom of what the top have, and essentially a flipping of the tables of some and that can be either violent, that revolution, or it can be relatively civil. And I think with an interview I saw with Ray Dalio, he talked about this is very much going to depend on, in terms of how this transaction, this redistribution happens, because I think the one thing is the redistribution is inevitable. The question and the uncertainty is, how is that redistribution going to take place? Is it going to be a violent revolution of pitchforks and torches, or is it going to be relatively civil and people are going to be pretty good with each other? And I suppose a big question as to determining which way it goes will be, do we have a common dream? Do we have a common goal? Or have we become too much of an individualistic society whereby we kind of become very selfish in a very real sense and don't care about and don't feel an affinity and don't feel a connection with those around us? And I'm worried, I don't know, this is just my feeling, it might be the latter.
So we definitely have a common enemy, man. I mean, we have a common enemy scenario. People are looking past differences.
That's true.
And, you know, look at the Cold War. I mean, in the East, the threat was the West. In the West, the threat was the East. But now, you know, what do Russia, America, China, and France all have in common? They have the same common enemy. You know, and my optimistic side would say that is going to give born to, you know, compassion and altruism, inventiveness in spirit. But my more pessimistic or perhaps more realistic self is concerned that actually maybe that is going to result in, you know, the violent revolution that we could speculate on. I mean, I think that the virus so far, in terms of society, has resulted in less polarization. So when coming back to politics, you know, we'd had a sustained period of growth and wealth creation after the 2008 financial crisis. And this has sort of given born to people becoming more and more polarized on certain issues. We've seen this with politics in the UK and politics in the US. Some of that has probably died down now because we have that shared enemy. But that is the real question. How will wealth be redistributed? Will it be just more money is printed and then leave it to the problem of the next administration? Will it be through a super high taxation regime? Or are we actually going to be looking at something from the bottom up that involves some kind of dramatic revolution? Or actually people going to live within their means more? Are people going to, you know, appreciate things like the outdoors more and growing their own food and reduce their spending overall and reduce their reliance on the credit economy, and actually live a bit more in their means? I mean, that'd be an optimistic and probably unlikely scenario, but
I think that's such an interesting point, like living more within their means. I think that's definitely a trend I see happening after all of this is blown over. There's certainly going to be a period of frugality from a utilitarian perspective because I need to be frugal because I don't have enough money. But there's also, I think, a death of maybe materialism, not a complete death, but maybe a lessening of the materialist life.
Yeah.
Because I certainly think that's been perpetuated by globalization, which a lot of people sort of think this COVID crisis will slow down, or potentially on the extremes end of the scale in terms of opinion, almost stop, because countries will realize that they've become over-reliant on certain manufacturing powerhouses, namely China, and they're better off, or they're sort of exposing themselves to overly exposing themselves to risk, particularly when such a crisis would strike, and not being self-sustainable enough. And I think this will even boil down, not from even the national level, but trickle down to the individual level. And it will be small things to start with, like people growing more vegetables and fruit in their garden and just reconnecting with what the necessities of life really are.
Absolutely, and I think that it will also give way to more creative pursuits. And if employees' expectations of their employers to work at home do increase, that will free up a lot of time that would have been spent perhaps commuting or in meetings or doing, that sort of dead time that is just functional, but where you're not actually achieving anything. Now, hopefully a lot of that time will be converted into either creative pursuits or things that involve more personal or family-led self-sufficiency. I think growing your own food and just creating products within the home, that's something that has really declined up until this pandemic. I mean, look at the death of DIY stores, because home ownership is quite sad. Home ownership is declining, and people's ability to make things and do things on their own, whether it's grow their own food, participate in some kind of harvest, create their own furniture and do work on their own house. All of these skills have been slowly undermined over the past few decades. So perhaps people will reconnect with nature more. Perhaps they'll reconnect with their own abilities to make things and actually be more self-sufficient going forward.
I definitely see all of those things happening because I already sort of saw those trends making inroads into society with the likes of rises of the Etsy website and sort of handcrafted and going back to basics lifestyle and really reconnecting with what's important in life, your kind of human relationships, whether that's your family or your friends or your significant others, and then reconnecting with the land, reconnecting with your ability, your physical abilities, whether that's exercise or creating something with your hands, molding clay, sculpting furniture, whatever it is. And yeah, I think it's certainly filling a void that we felt probably for a longer period of time that we're aware of. But yeah, certainly Ray Dalio, that interview I saw with him on TED, it was really fascinating because he talked about sort of 4 key driving forces in our economy. And if I can, I'll just go into those in a little bit of depth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of the first one links into what we're just talking about, productivity, human productivity, human inventiveness, and the ability of the human to adapt. It's you don't come across it in any sort of capacity in the animal kingdom. Nothing comes close. So this is by far the most powerful dynamic out of the 4 in his view, and it arises from people learning, inventing, adapting and doing things really well. It grows slowly, so this is something that's pretty incremental, but as you know, with compound interest, these things grow and are a reliable source of increasing our living standards ultimately. So and it's not volatile because knowledge in itself as a thing isn't volatile. It generally, we're not talking about the barbaric times. The Library of Alexandria was burned down and half of human knowledge was burnt down in an instant. We're talking about a gradually building knowledge base that probably is less and less corruptible as we build on databases and blockchains and all the rest of it. So productivity, it's a very optimistic one, and it's something that I think is very inspiring and something that never really stops growing as long as we're still here. Inventiveness, the ability to adapt to any given situation, fosters growth and ultimately a improvement in our living standards over time. Second is sort of the short-term debt cycle. So the booms and busts we're familiar with within our lifetimes. So the last one we would have seen would have been 2008. So periods of growth and then recession. And that has sort of a frequency of about 8 to 10 years. So with the last one we saw was the 2008 one. And then I suppose the one before that would have been the dot-com bubble. Where you get hypes on a certain industry or you get hypes on a certain market. The subprime mortgage crisis of the 2008 is a prime example of that. And then overlaid on top of that, all these regular short-term debt cycles of 8 to 10 years, you've got the long-term debt cycle, which is sort of on the frequency of 50 to 75 years. And these are often a catalyst for starting a new type of money. So you certainly saw that post World War II with the new type of money, a new monetary system with the Bretton Woods monetary system. So it was very much out with the old, in with the new, a new world order, if you like. Okay, and then, so this new world order was certainly very American centric. 70% of the money and credit that exists in the economy today is running in dollars. So that just shows you how dominant the dollar is. And then finally, so we've got productivity.
The new gold standard, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people would argue that going off the gold standard was the biggest mistake we ever made, because there was at least some fundamental value to gold. And I think we'll go into that a bit later. It's a really interesting topic. So you've got productivity, short-term debt cycle, long-term debt cycle, and then finally you've got politics. So I think politics, if you really want to distill it down into sort of very simple terms, it's how we are with each other, how we interact with each other. And there's sort of two levels to that. So you've got the internal politics, which is how we deal with the wealth gap. Do we have that common mission dream I talked about earlier? Or do we fight over that wealth? And it's a more individualistic society, every man for himself sort of thing. So in this new world order, there will be a question or something that needs to play out as to whether it's going to be a destructive transition or a relatively peaceful one. I hope it's the latter, but we just don't know. And either way, I think that wealth redistribution has to take place. And it's just a question of how it happens. And then finally, there's the external politics. So that's the international politics. So we're certainly seeing a dynamic or a tension that's probably been going on prior to the virus as well, which was China, which is the rising power challenging the establishment, which was the United States. And so there's a competition there. There's the feeling of manufacturing. The manufacturing base was swept from under the US's feet and stolen by China. And that's very much been kind of the line pushed by the Trump administration. And that leads to competition and potentially the risk of war in the very worst case. And again, there's the question of whether that's going to be a productive or a destructive relationship. But ultimately, when you talk about politics as the fourth category there, it's ultimately a stress test, both on the interpersonal level and the international level.
Yeah. So interesting, all those factors. And what's also really interesting is how interlinked they are. So you mentioned productivity, and that has a direct link to your long-term debt cycles, because we've seen a steady decline in productivity as, long-term debt and expansion of the money supply is increased. There's, as we said before, you can't create wealth simply through printing money. But when you have that expectation, that's going to have a very adverse impact on your productivity levels. But how are you seeing all these factors responding to the coronavirus? I mean, you could talk about debt, you could talk about productivity, you could talk about the international political landscape. How do you think that they're all going to be reshaped as a result? Because one thing I will put out there, and that's, we talked a little earlier about frugality. Now, with the way that economies are run now, and with the constant preoccupation with using gross national product and gross domestic product as indicators of wealth creation, people who are frugal are not very good for the economy, in terms of their own personal discipline. And, they're usually, I would say, more interesting people, and people who are more able to be self-sufficient, and they're usually more inventive. But they're often not very good for the economy in the sense that they don't spend very much. So how do you see all these impacts on a societal and economic level playing out as a result of the virus?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, with the if I start with the long-term debt cycle, I think there's certainly a sense that we're in one. So with this frequency being 50 to 75 years, the last one being let's count it as 45 when we came out of it and the new Bretton Woods monetary system was established. Let's count it from there. So that is 5 years. But if you look at it in the debt cycle, yes, it is a severe thing. These things happen once in a generation. And although this is quite an evocative term, I don't sort of shy away from using it. We are going to be going into something termed a depression. This isn't another 2008 recession. This will be a depression, but I want to be careful with that term because it's extremely evocative and can be quite an emotional term, and evoke all kinds of fears and anxieties, and understandably so, right?
Absolutely.
Because we will be seeing some form of a significant fall in economic output. We already are. It's just the numbers aren't in. So Q1 results, Q2 results, probably even more so. But they're also double-digit unemployment rates are definitely going to, may well be the thing we see.
Yeah.
So question is, are we in that? Yeah, we probably are. It's just a matter of time before these things play out and we see the results. So I think there's a question of how we deal with it. Obviously, a lot of money's being printed at the minute, 0% interest rates, same dynamics at play that we saw back in the 30-45 period. But we've seen this very much throughout recorded history, right? So, but one way to look at it is these things pass, right? And so the emancipator in a lot of ways, and the emancipation, and I sort of align with Ray on this view, is certainly it's going to be human inventiveness and the human ability to adapt that will pull us out of this situation, because that's the one constant, that's the one true thing that really grows, and that's the one true thing that really brings value. You can talk about the short-term and long-term debt cycle, that's all accounting, and it's kind of in the fairy sphere. It's all numbers on a screen. The real value is in the services delivered and the goods sold, and that is purely through the human inventive spirit and ability to reinvent themselves, to adapt themselves very quickly, because that's why we've survived as long as we can. That's why we're the dominant species. So one mindset as proposed by Simon Sinek, I don't know if you've heard of Simon, but he's he's written a few books, and I think he's a psychologist of sorts and a sociologist. But he talks about the infinite mindset. So although that sounds like a funny term to talk about, but the infinite mindset almost looks at, if you look at things in millennia rather than sort of the short term few years or 10 years left or right, it gives you an incredible perspective that these things have happened in the past, they've passed, and this will pass too. And it's sort of giving you that realization of like, this is fine. Like, we will deal with this one way or another. We've done it before, we'll do it again. Okay, so let's not get all panicky and make rash decisions in the time of crisis, or in the point of the stressor, the point of, I suppose, maximum stress. Let's take a few steps back, not just one step back, but quite run back and look back at the whole big picture and realize that these things have happened in the past and the human spirit has triumphed and pulled us out. So I think it will definitely be the human spirit, the human ability to adapt and invent that will pull us out of this. And I think everything in between is just money and credit, and that's just an accounting issue. Yeah. The real value lies in the value add services and goods that we produce. Okay, so yes, the accounting, from an accounting perspective, this is quite a disaster, but don't forget that constant beating heart of human productivity.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute point. I mean, throughout different eras, whether it's been wars or famines, or anything else on the historical map, humans have been ingenious in inventing value-adding goods that improve people's happiness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at it so many levels. We've adapted from being foragers, and we've always been good at that, and then the Industrial Revolution and agriculture and everything. I think this is just another hurdle, and probably compared to the ones we've looked at in the past, a relatively minor one, because once you have that sort of infinite mindset, as Simon puts it, it's just another hurdle on your track. And if you look at it, they're relatively regular. We've done it in the past, we'll do it again. There's no reason why this one shouldn't be any different. Yes, it's hard for a period of time, but we will see this through. And I think that's quite a marked move away from something where you're kind of being reactive and just reacting to the crisis at the time, which will never lead to sort of smart or wise decision making.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, sort of the reactionary approach never leads to progress, does it? Because
it tends to exacerbate the problem. So I think with the virus, you had to be quick on your feet, and I think we probably saw some dithering, like we talked about earlier, from our government. But there's certainly a lot of value in just giving yourself the time and space to think about, what our grandparents, our forefathers, all of our ancestors have been through in the past, potentially much worse than this, and sort of realizing that this is a storm we're more than capable of weathering, and this is not a time for despair, but a time for potentially opportunity, because there will be companies that benefit from this.
Yes.
So I think there's almost two companies, or two sort of flavors of company that will benefit from this. So you've got your kind of run-of-the-mill meat and potato companies, your Cambo Soup equivalent, kind of your Kraft Heinz, if you want to call it that, that are always in demand because they satisfy the necessities of life. And so those aren't going anywhere, right? Because people are always going to need them. And that's the reason why in a recession or a depression even, grocery stores don't do too badly. Then on the other side of the scale, you're going to have the cutting edge innovators, those who can adapt and innovate well. So and not just any innovators who can adapt and innovate well, those with sort of poor balance sheets with high levels of debt will potentially suffer and collapse. But those who can adapt and innovate well are on the cutting edge of technology, and there's an appetite for that cutting edge technology, like the one we talked about earlier, namely automation. Let's take that example, and have strong balance sheets. They're going to do incredibly well, because there's definitely an appetite for meeting or trying to fill that gap. I mean, this is a workforce revolution, right? We've never seen anything, certainly within our lifetimes, of this magnitude, where sort of the ideas and norms of work are questioned or thrown into question. It's so extreme and so suddenly.
I think there's been a lot of literature put out there and a lot of podcasts and ideas about the reorganization of work. You've got books like, is it the 4-Hour Working Week, and you've got various approaches to outsourcing.
Tim Ferriss.
Right, and
shout out Tim.
Remote working and all these kind of restructuring, but there's never actually been a catalyst to actually kick that into play. There's never really been a reason to justify that to your employer. And coming onto the note of automation, we're approaching a time where people are going to be very jittery about human contact, where shaking hands is becoming a taboo, and looking at various industries. I mean, in the travel industry, we're going to probably be seeing more and more keyless entry, where people slash down the touch points between landing at your destination and actually getting to your hotel room in your resort. But then just general, really. I mean, taking for example the groceries industry. You have players on the market that are developing automated solutions to deliveries and things like that, and I think a lot of that is going to really be fueled throughout this this time of fear, of your poor hygiene and things like that. So automation is going to be definitely kicked up a grade, I think, as a result of these new expectations for both work and life.
Yeah, you can't look at this virus anything other than an accelerator for automation, and probably a host of other technologies, which I'm not that close to, but I'm sure there are a whole host. I think there's certainly, if I look at what Ray, that interview with Ray on TED, which I do recommend you go out and watch, actually. It's really good.
Yeah.
So I think we talked about sort of the run-of-the-mill, what's going to do well, the run-of-the-mill, the innovators. But also I suppose people are looking at safe havens, right? People are I bet there's some people who are hoarding cash, right? There are probably, society's going to divide kind of down the middle on this, but they're getting government welfare and they're just going to be spending it how they like and probably having very nice dinners at home and all this sort of thing, which is fair enough. And, the levels of alcohol consumption have gone up drastically because, the pubs aren't there and that's a big part of British culture anyway. But apart from cash, cash people think, that's a safe bet. Cash isn't going to go anywhere and put it in my mattress, that old view. But cash is probably potentially one of the worst things you can do, because if you think about it, there's a near enough 2% inflation to it, right? You're paying a 2% tax year on year, if you think about it. If you look at the average level of inflation, that's what we're looking at. So there are alternative markets, and people are flocking to the likes of precious metals, namely gold.
Right.
And you and you're a big fan of gold. Tell me about gold, man, because you're one of the people who is a big advocate of this, and thank God I listened to you, because back in 2019 I bought a nice truckload of I actually bought some Canadian gold, and
nice maple leaves.
Yes, golden maple leaves. They delivered them yesterday. They're wonderful. I've been polishing them all evening. It's the only thing I have left. But no,
that's all that's left. You have no house anymore. You got your maple leaves though, so you're good to go.
And if there's nothing left to eat, I'll just start chewing on the gold. I've heard it's a soft metal. I'm sure that'll be the nice last meal.
I'm sure you can gum it down.
I'm sure I'll enjoy it. I'm sure I'll enjoy it over the tears and blood. But no, because you're a fan of buying the physical stuff. You see, I've bought the physical stuff, but through an ETF, I believe. So it's there in Canada, and if this thing ever defaults, I believe they're sending it over. But go on, Leo, tell me.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up gold, and I looked at the gold
just open this can.
Price. Yeah, well, I looked up the price of a troy ounce of gold in dollars this morning.
You sent me that crazy graph today.
Yeah, and it's astounding because we're seeing a huge increase. I mean, I think mid-March to now, it's gone up by about $300 to $350 for an ounce, which is a great proportion of its entire value. There's a fantastic quote from the book Gold, Peace and Prosperity by the former politician Ron Paul, where he talks about the money supply going bad. And I think it was an older relative of his that said, don't keep too much cash, convert some of it into precious metals in case it goes bad. Talking about money as if it's milk going off or bread going moldy. And I think that that's a really healthy way to look at money, mainly because at the end of the day, it holds no intrinsic value. I mean, it's ultimately paper. It's useless for any kind of productive capacity. Whereas gold, as divisible and portable and usable as it is for so many different things, from dentures to semiconductors, it holds that intrinsic value. Now, I know you'll agree with this. I mean, it's pretty hard to dispute this. It's a financial fact that gold is an echo chamber, in the sense that it is a force field from market forces. So whenever you have a particularly adverse event, it could be 9/11, it could be a solar flare, it could be the virus we're dealing with now. Most stocks will plummet. Most stocks and shares will plummet. The value of money will plummet. Interest rates will plummet as well, which means that savers become losers, as much as I hate to say that. And conversely, you'll have the government increasing the money supply as people spend less. And that increase in the money supply will, as you brought up, create inflationary taxes, which often go unnoticed. So people's savings will be very adversely affected, but gold stays strong. And 9 times out of 10 in any sort of crisis, gold is a fantastic thing to possess, because not only will it retain its value, but it will nearly always increase its value and increase its use.
Yeah, so I'm definitely glad I got that gold back in late 2019, given what we're going through now. It's a great hedge against market volatility in general. And I'm actually considering silver now as well. And just to caveat all of this, guys, we are certainly not advising you buy anything. We are by no means of the stretch of the imagination, though we'd love to be. We are not financial advisors. We are not professional investors. We're absolute amateurs and charlatans, if I'm honest.
Complete charlatans and phonies. And
so don't listen to anything we say. Don't buy gold, you idiots.
No, don't. In fact, all you need to do is hoard your money. In fact, hoard monies that are now obsolete. Hoard the Weimar Republic money in your mattresses. So just do the opposite of what we're telling you. But on a serious note, I mean, we're not financial advisors, but this is anecdotal contributions that may be useful to some people out there.
Yes, I think we pretty much absolved ourselves of any potential suing potential there. That's great. Great job, Leo.
Yeah.
That's great.
Libel is another matter. Yeah, I mean, gold is insurance. You're not just buying a store of value. You're buying insurance from the money supply potentially going bad. And right now, the money supply is really going bad. You know, inflation's going up, interest's being cut. So I think that, you know, having something that is actually valuable in and of itself, intrinsically, you know, it's hard to dispute that. It's hard to argue against that, right?
Yeah, I think gold has always historically been a safe haven in times of uncertainty, and I've not known more uncertain times than we're in right now. And I just
you know,
go on.
That I wanted to ask you about the crypto response to this, because I know you're a lot more knowledgeable than I am on cryptocurrencies.
No idea what's going on.
But with cryptocurrencies, I'm pretty much clueless, and I know that some people see, you know, your sort of your Bitcoin and their derived currencies as an cyber equivalent to gold, just because they're finite.
Yeah, that's literally it. It's the digital. They call it or term it the digital equivalent of gold or digital gold. Particularly Bitcoin, not so much the others, because they have increased, and I think Ripple, for example, which is one I'm invested in, but I think anyone should be. Should caveat all of this. I need legal absolution on every level. So yeah, I think Bitcoin, because it's by definition finite, so in that sense, there's never going to be more Bitcoins, and therefore, as long as there's an ever-growing incremental demand, then the view is it will always grow because there's no more of it. And because it's backed up by global ledgers, as in there's many thousands of servers all around the world backing up the value of this cryptocurrency, then it's not going anywhere. So yeah, and you know what? I'm glad you brought up cryptos, because when Ray talked about the Bretton Woods monetary policy. Thanks, man. Yeah, the monetary system rather. It did cross my mind. You know, is crypto going to be the Bretton Woods of the 2020s? It crossed my mind.
Well,
it crossed my mind.
I think that's an interesting observation, because obviously, there was some pushback from, constant reliance on credit and debit cards and contactless payments. And rightly so, people were interested in cash. And holding a physical store of wealth as they saw it. As coronavirus is going to trigger far more reliance on your contactless payment methods, if they're all ones and zeros on a screen, then maybe that is going to pave the way for more of a crypto reliance. I don't know. I mean, I've not actually taken a look at the value of Bitcoin for a long time now. I mean, is it going up? Is it going down? What's the score there?
It's nowhere near its all-time highs, which I think we saw back, if I'm not wrong, sort of 2018, 2017 time. Reason being, I don't really know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how it works. Nobody knows why it goes up. Nobody knows why it goes down, which can be said for a lot of markets and markets in general, because I think it's something crazy like 80% of trades are algorithmic through nature. Right. So I think there was an interesting statistic I saw where the Goldman Sachs number of traders on the trading floor, physical traders actually executing trades, in the span of something like 10 years, it dropped from the hundreds to 2.
What? 2 traders?
Yeah, 2 traders, and true traders in the real sense of the term, right? Not because I think that you've got executioners, ones that just execute a command driven through an algo.
Right, okay.
And then there's others that would generally look at more macroeconomic factors and almost trade more like a asset management fund, where you're looking at the timescale of 2 to 3 months as opposed to minutes and seconds, because the domain of minutes and seconds in terms of timescale is now firmly the domain of algos. Because how many trades? Look, an algo can do 1,000 trades in a second. How many can a human do?
1.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you're very quickly approaching the point of humans being trumped by algorithms in that, when you're talking about that time scale. I think the reason you've seen asset management rise, and some banks even creating their asset management divisions, namely Deutsche Bank or other banks I've seen do that as well, is because I think they're seeing the human element being relevant on the timescale of months rather than seconds, and that's for the very reasons we just discussed. But it's a very interesting relationship that and partnership of algos and human principles. So the human mind is a great at sort of creative thinking and establishing principles based on that creative thinking, but it's very limited in terms of capacity. Whereas if you look at computers, it's almost the flip side. Computers' capacity is almost unlimited, right? And what you can do in that partnership is the computer's capacity can heavily leverage the human thinking and replicate that thinking and those principles. So algorithmic decision making in and of itself is highly limited, right? So ultimately, if you just let an algo up, or if you let machine learning do its thing, you give it a huge data set, teradata, loads of data, terabytes and terabytes, and let it churn the data and digest the data, it will spit out an algorithm. Now, it will spit out an algorithm, but you won't understand how that algorithm's been derived because you're invisible to the process. It's a black box from your perspective. So the mistake of machine learning alone is one that's quite common. If it's not tempered through, or at least streamed through, human principles. Because if fundamentally, right, if you don't understand the cause-effect relationship about how you got to where you got to, then you fundamentally don't understand the principles through which the algorithm's governed. It may do great for the first 10 minutes, the first 10 years, the first 50 years of its life, but then when faced with unprecedented circumstances, it doesn't have guiding principles to guide its decisioning. You need that human hand in there to pull it out when required, because you can put... Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, I just thought I'd chip in there before I forget. This is where a lot of the more astute companies and investors in artificial intelligence are investing in, time and money into, the augmented intelligence movement. So not the pie in the sky thinking of we're reaching general AI very, very soon, and that we're going to just feed in as much data as possible, and a bot will do all the analytical processes. But actually, humans are enhanced by AI, and in an augmented sense, they need to work hand in hand with AI to get the maximum returns. Was that your line of thinking?
Yes, because I think some of the machine learning and then the algos that come off the back of that machine learning in and of themselves can churn out quite nonsensical decisions and answers, and whether you buy or sell, or whether a diagnosis even, because algos and machine learning are ever more present in the medical industry. And in fact, I was very fascinating talk with the consultant I was speaking to recently, and he was talking about how they've got vast amounts of data from disparate sources globally, and how they want to somehow consolidate this data to draw meaningful insights. Now, when they first put the machine learning to the task, it did churn out a lot of nonsensical decisions and diagnoses. And it was only when you kind of put the human hand in and tempered it and streamed it and guided it that you began to understand that there were certain outliers it was taking into account that it shouldn't, and that was skewing the data and therefore the result. So it's only through that healthy partnership, for now at least, you don't have a truly cognitive machine learning. Machine learning is in and of itself quite stupid. It will follow, it will learn, but it can't tell whether it's right or wrong with its result. It doesn't question a result, it just spits out an answer. So I think you can do one of two ways with an algorithm in terms of getting an algorithm. You can put a lot of data into a computer and it spits out an algorithm, and a lot of people go down that route and make that mistake. Or you can first specify the instructions and have it follow the machine learning, and I suppose refine your principles, thereby enabling your thinking, or rather leveraging your thinking, and I suppose giving it many times or many powers of magnitude, more power than it would normally have in your mind, because it can deal with that much more data. And the key difference between those two is that you do understand the cause-effect relationships, because if you don't, then you don't understand what you're dealing with, and there will be inevitably unprecedented events that are not in your sample size. And so that will automatically throw your algo. So take the example of what the markets are doing now with COVID. You'd have to go back as far as the 30s to understand what's going on.
Right. And even then, because of the unprecedented nature of COVID, presumably, an algorithm's capability to be predictive is very hampered by this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I talk about the medical context, they experienced a very similar outcome in that with the machine learning alone, it too churned out pretty nonsensical answers which made no sense and actually brought very little value to them. If anything, confused the landscape a little bit. So it needs to be streamed either upstream or downstream. I suggest, I'd imagine it would be easier to do it upstream, so you're not kind of getting the machine learning firing off in non-productive avenues, if you see what I mean. If it's going down an avenue, you don't want it to end up with a nonsensical answer and then spend hours analysing whether that answer's right, when you kind of should have tempered it and cut it. It's almost like pruning a plant. You should have pruned that thing when it was growing rather than let it grow, and now you've ended up with a useless branch. Right.
It's just gone off down in a direction that was completely unhelpful.
Right, and if you stream it at the stem, then you know it's going to obey certain principles.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty interesting. I mean, how do you see artificial intelligence playing out in solving real world problems that have been brought on by COVID? How do you see that, and how do you see the public really taking it upon themselves to use automated solutions to stay safer?
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence is going through something of a renaissance at the minute. Maybe not so much in the real realm and real use case, in terms of businesses and true applications, as much as people would like to think, because I think it's certainly more in the public consciousness than ever before. Now, whether that's being reflected in real applications in the real world, I'd question that, because from what I've seen of artificial intelligence, there's certainly machine learning, and if you want to put machine learning under artificial intelligence, I would. But however, we are yet to achieve, and probably quite a way away, probably decades, quite a few of them for that matter, from something called general artificial intelligence, whereby you've got something that thinks like the human mind and pretty much emulates the brain. So that's real brain emulation, and something that would utilize neural nets, or Elon Musk talks about this in his latest podcast on Joe Rogan. Actually, it's really interesting. So neural nets, and we're moving in that direction, but they're quite narrow in terms of their purpose. So you take the example of a neural net or an AI that works is specific to chess or the game Go. They're very good at that one set of tasks, but then ask them to mow the lawn or to tell you how to, it's very very narrow in that sense. There's nothing that's approaching general. Yeah, there's nothing that's approaching general artificial intelligence at the moment. I think it's definitely, if you want to put, it's a matter of definition ultimately. If you want to put machine learning under the banner of artificial intelligence, sure, that's going to increase exponentially. And I think, like I said, technological transformation, new technologies, digital transformations are only going to accelerate given the current conditions. Because one, employers, companies are going to look at headcount replacement ultimately, but also just there's the here and now. How do we cope with the current situation? We don't have people in the call center. We need more chatbots, to give an example.
It comes back to the dominance of the online travel agencies that have a duopoly over the industry. So Expedia and Booking.com often take 15 to 20% commissions from hotels, resorts, casinos, airlines, you name it, worldwide. And when you look down at the balance sheet, that is an insanely high cost that has been going up and up as time has gone on. Now, with the nature of COVID, in the sense that it's really decided who the winners and losers are in the travel industry, and it has knocked so many companies out of the water, now is the time where people are taking off the brakes with the online travel agencies and actually shifting their chips and shifting their intellectual investments into chatbots and into all these machine learned algorithms that are able to deliver a better customer experience, or basically just deliver better operational results. So we're actually seeing power structures changing in that industry, and I'm sure that that's not unique to the travel industry. I'm sure that the COVID-19 pandemic is causing a whole band of industries to rethink joint ventures and rethink partnerships, develop more things in-house, but ultimately invest more in automation, because it is the way of the future, and it is the way that people are going to be able to reconnect with their customers in a more safe and efficient manner.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that, mate. I mean, I think that there's two things happening. One is probably the immediate reaction of companies. How much do we rely on our human capital and our employees? Hugely. So realizing the importance of that, but then also thinking, right, how can we emulate their roles or try and replicate their roles as much as possible given the situation? And I think it's much about, it's a fine balancing act between sort of retaining talent and knowledge, that tacit knowledge, it's just so hard to quantify, but also a fine balancing act of that and the bottom line of survival. Like, we look at Rolls-Royce, they cut 9,000 jobs. That's 20% of their workforce, or there or thereabouts, 17%, I think, if you really want to be specific. But
Right.
that's an unbelievable cut, and then, I mean, that's a giant that's a massive employer in the Midlands for the UK, and I mean,
Yeah. Right. Well, look at Air Canada. I mean, cutting 20,000 jobs, and that's a flagship carrier that should benefit from government subsidies.
Yeah, and mate, that this is not something that's going to recover overnight. Look, people think for some reason, and I know it's tempting and easy to think this way, but that we will sort of be back to normal by the end of the year. It's not the case. Not the case. I mean, the CEO, when he was interviewed on LBC, the CEO of Rolls-Royce, that is, he said this could quite easily take 3 to 5 years before we get to what we had in December.
Absolutely.
Back to that level of normality. Look how much the world has changed in the span of 5 months.
That's quite scary that it could. I mean,
imagine if you were in a coma and woke up and you're like, "What the hell's going on?"
Like you've been put in a coma, and then you wake up and the world has just changed. I mean, that's scary. But then it's believable that it is going to take that much time to recover, because if you think of how vulnerable society is, another thing that this has highlighted is just how quickly all the progress that we've made in the past 15 years can just be wiped right off the map.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It just, I suppose it highlights the fragility and the brevity of, it's funny because it's on two levels. It's the vulnerability and brevity of our economy and the systems we've become so used to and taken for granted, but also of our lives. Like, our lives in quite a big way have been turned upside down. I mean, for to more or lesser extent, depending on where you are in the world. But life is not what it once was, and potentially never will be.
So what can we learn from this situation? What are we trying to get across with this podcast? Well, I suppose it comes down to the big take home that humanity is a very, very fragile beast. Even in the West of all places, whereby sort of in the past 2 decades we've come to get complacent and feel that no problems in other parts of the world can touch the West. Here we are. So I think we've learned that humanity is a very fragile organism, and Andre and I, our condolences are with anybody out there listening into this who has been adversely affected by the coronavirus or who's suffered any sort of loss from it. It really is a very difficult time. So our thoughts and our prayers are with you all. I think going forward, we'd like to sort of convey the interesting nature of how work and life as we know it will adapt to the current climate, the current situation. I think everyone's waiting with bated breath to see how things like automation will be accelerated, how the remote working phenomenon will be accelerated, and also broader cultural changes that may come out of this. I mean, the attitude to materialism that we've all come to know and love, and society in general, how will that be reorganized over the next few years as a result of this? And I'm sure we're going to experience some very dramatic changes. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, Brobears.
So I think the development landscape in whichever field or industry we're talking about is obviously been markedly affected and will be affected in a very tangible sense from here on out. I think in the immediate short term, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, particularly with our healthcare systems all around the world. And in some ways, this has been a good learning curve for them so that we're better equipped to deal with the next pandemic when that does come, because there will be another one. These pandemics do come and go, but there will be inevitably another one to follow this. And so I think a crucial thing is that we pick up the lessons that we learned this time around and be ready to implement that much more efficiently next time around, and to avoid, obviously, and minimize to as much of an extent as we can the death and tragedy that pandemics bring. So it's been strict or quite a serious subject matter, but certainly, as sort of echo Leo's words, I see this first inaugural Brobears Talk episode as almost the first in a series around COVID and the repercussions of the virus, because it's such a huge topic and probably deserves a few episodes in and of itself. So, yeah, in conclusion, I hope you've all enjoyed the inaugural Brobears podcast as much as we've enjoyed recording it. We'll be publishing these actually on a bi-weekly basis, so look out for those. And yeah, we'll be seeing you on the next one. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Over and out. Leo, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, Brobear. Over and out.